It was just another quiet morning at the museum. The janitor, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and worn boots, moved silently between rows of exhibits. A group of students shuffled in behind their guide. "That lady work here?" one boy asked. The guide didn't pause. "Just the cleaning staff." But then, the speakers in the Middle East War Gallery crackled to life. Not music, not narration. A sharp, commanding female voice cut through the air. "Unit Bravo, move now! Left flank exposed!" The children stopped. The guide froze. The janitor did too, broom midair, eyes slowly lifting toward the speakers. That voice was hers, and the truth that followed silenced the entire museum. Her name was Sarah Mallory, 52 years old, quiet by nature, and thinner than she used to be, like life had slowly carved the weight off her frame. She had the kind of posture that hinted at a disciplined past, straight-backed, shoulders square, but her movements were small, careful, as though she was always mindful of taking up too much space. By day, Sarah was the cleaning lady at the National War and Conflict Museum, a vast, echoing place that told the story of battles most Americans only knew from documentaries. She swept floors no one noticed, mopped up scuff marks by the entrance, and took out the trash after the crowds had gone home. Most days, no one called her name. But before this quiet life, she had worn a uniform too. 23 years earlier, Sarah was a communications technician in the U.S. Army, deployed in several classified operations during the early 2000s. She was part of a rapid response signals unit tasked with maintaining live links between frontline squads and command centers. No room for error, no time for fear. Her calm voice had guided medevac choppers through sandstorms, coordinated cover fire during a chaotic night extraction into Crit, and kept entire platoons from going dark under enemy fire. It was in Kandahar that her service came to an end. A roadside IED detonated just 10 feet from the outpost wall she was stationed behind. The blast left her concussed, with permanent tinnitus and occasional light sensitivity. She was medically discharged. There was no parade, no fanfare, just a form to sign, a folded flag, and a quiet seat on a military flight home. Back in the States, Sarah slipped into the background. She applied for work where people didn't ask questions. The museum was hiring for night custodial staff. She never mentioned her past. Now she lives alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, her walls lined with secondhand books on military history and old shortwave radios. On her dresser is a single photo in a simple wooden frame. 6 soldiers, dusty and grinning, standing in front of a Humvee with Echo Team spray-painted on the bumper. One of them, the tallest, has his hand resting lightly on Sarah's shoulder. His name is etched into a headstone now. Every Friday, she takes the early bus out of town to the National Military Cemetery. She doesn't talk while she's there. She just kneels by one particular grave for a few quiet minutes. Some Fridays, she brings flowers. Other times, she just stands in silence, fingers tracing a name she never forgot. Sarah never wanted recognition. She didn't keep her story a secret out of shame, but out of reverence. The way she saw it, those who didn't make it home deserved the headlines. She was just lucky. And so every morning she returned to the museum, sweeping the same polished floors she once helped defend in spirit, unseen, unthanked, and completely at peace with being forgotten. Until, one morning, she wasn't. It started with static. Sarah had just finished mopping the east wing of the museum when she passed by the Operation Iron Echo exhibit. The sound system, usually set to play a loop narration of battlefield radio excerpts, was crackling again, sharp bursts of white noise interrupting every few seconds. She paused, listening. It wasn't just a loose wire or faulty speaker. Something was off in the playback itself, and it wasn't just the sound quality. She stood quietly behind the velvet rope, listening more intently than any visitor that day. To most, the clip was background noise, just a grainy voice barking commands over gunfire. But Sarah heard more. The cadence was wrong. The phrasing was inconsistent with field protocol. And worst of all, the coordinates in the audio were inaccurate, off by enough to cost lives in a real operation. That wasn't how it happened. She knew because she had been there. Later that evening, once the museum was empty and her shift had ended, Sarah sat at the small staff break room table and pulled out a pen. On the back of a maintenance request form, she began writing. To whom it may concern, I noticed an error in the audio playback at the Iron Echo exhibit. The second transmission includes a call to shift east, but based on tactical positioning at the time, in standard Bravo protocols, the command should have been to reposition north. Also, the code word anchor fire was not adopted until 6 months after the date listed in the caption. The voice in the recording belongs to Sergeant Holloway, but the tonal modulation suggests it's a mixed sample, possibly altered. I hope this helps correct the presentation. She didn't sign her name. She left the note on the front desk, assuming nothing would come of it, but it did. 2 days later, the museum's operations manager, David Klein, stood in his office holding the handwritten note with furrowed brows. He had nearly tossed it into the public suggestions bin, where most non-signed feedback ended up, but something about the tone of the message stopped him. The corrections weren't casual guesses. Whoever wrote this had first-hand knowledge of radio protocol and battlefield communication logistics. Even the comment about the code word anchor fire was oddly specific. He had to look it up himself. Klein walked down to the museum's tech archives and spoke to Janet, the lead audio engineer. He handed her the note and said, "Can you verify any of this? Because if this is right, we've had the wrong war transcript running for years." Janet, skeptical at first, ran a deeper diagnostic on the source file. The clip was part of a larger audio batch donated by the Department of Defense, processed through voice smoothing filters and stored on a server that hadn't been updated in nearly a decade. When she pulled up the raw recording, Janet's face changed. The clean version they'd been playing to the public was, in fact, incomplete. Portions of the original file had been truncated during import. Worse yet, a different female voice, calmer, more precise, was present in the original, issuing key directives that had never made it into the exhibit. Her timing was flawless, her words clear, her control under fire, uncanny. Janet turned to Klein. "This isn't Sergeant Holloway," she said. "This woman, whoever she is, was running the show." They checked the metadata. The audio file was labeled unconfirmed 03 Bravo, field feed, female alpha, dated April 2003. That night, Klein reviewed the museum's employee roster and security logs. It didn't take long to realize the note had been written by someone who was in the building during closing hours, someone who had direct access to the exhibit. The next morning, he watched from his office window as Sarah Mallory entered through the back entrance, clocked in, and quietly began cleaning the central atrium like she always did. Head down, sleeves rolled, not speaking to anyone. He watched her work for a full minute before whispering to himself, "Who are you?" At first, no one paid much attention to the glitch. It was written off as a routine tech issue, a small burst of static, a hiccup in the audio loop playing in the museum's Iron Echo exhibit. The tech team logged it. Janet, the museum's audio archivist, went down to investigate. She ran diagnostics, expecting the usual. A corrupted file, maybe a dusty speaker wire. But what she found was not routine. Buried within the digital archive under layers of filtered and cropped audio clips sat a file marked unconfirmed, field feed Bravo re. Alpha, no metadata, no name source, just a timestamp, April 2003. She almost skipped it, but something about the file name made her pause. She clicked it, and then the room filled with chaos, gunfire, radio interference, heavy breathing, barked commands from multiple directions. Then, suddenly, cutting through the confusion like a scalpel through gauze, a voice. "Unit Bravo, hold position. Delta, you're exposed left side. Reposition 2 clicks east. Medivac inbound. Call sign confirmed. Widow Mark, I'm taking command." Janet froze in her chair. The voice was unmistakable. The same calm, commanding tone she'd heard in the glitch. But this wasn't just any voice in the background. This voice was leading. She replayed it, slowed it down, ran it through clarity filters. Every line matched battlefield protocol. Every call-out followed trained comms discipline. Whoever was speaking wasn't guessing. They were trained, under pressure, and in charge. And that name, Widow Mark. She'd seen it once before, in a classified reference she couldn't trace back. At the time, she assumed it was code for a drone or tactical maneuver. But now it was clear. It was a person, and that person had led a field rescue operation during one of the most chaotic assaults of 2003, the one the military simply referred to in records as Iron Echo. Janet walked, almost ran, to David Klein's office. David listened to the recording in complete silence. Once, twice, 3 times. Each repetition only confirmed what his gut already told him. This wasn't a supporting voice on a team channel. This was a commanding presence. Someone who had stepped into leadership when the official chain of command had collapsed. Someone who had taken charge when others fell. And then David remembered the anonymous note. The one that pointed out specific tactical errors in the publicly played version of the recording. The handwriting, the terminology, the confidence behind the corrections. He opened the drawer and pulled it out. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly turned to his computer and pulled up the employee list. There were only a handful of staff who had access to the archives during closing hours. Only one of them had clocked in near the time of the glitch. Only one of them had served, as he later learned quietly, in the Army. Sarah Mallory, the janitor. He checked the old personnel file. No mention of combat service. Just communication specialist, retired. No awards, no citations. But then again, classified missions never show up on paper. He stared out the window into the atrium. There she was, pushing a mop bucket, calm, silent, invisible if you weren't looking. But now he saw her, not as a custodian, but as a leader who once commanded in the fire and kept 14 men alive through the darkest hour of their lives. That night, David made calls. He reached out to a retired colonel who had once lectured at the museum on battlefield leadership. The man asked David to play the clip. After a long pause, he responded, "I was on the other end of that voice. We never knew who she was. Reeve, our captain, went down in the first blast. If she hadn't taken over, none of them would have made it out." David asked why no one ever credited her. The colonel sighed. "Because the mission was blacklisted. We were told not to file full reports. Reeve got the medal, posthumously, but everyone else? Silence. And Widowmark. We never knew her real name. Just that voice, just that steady voice in the storm." 21 years later, that voice had surfaced again, by accident. And now the world, or at least this small part of it, had a chance to know what it meant. The museum didn't issue a public statement. Sarah didn't want that. She declined every form of recognition David suggested, even when he offered to speak to military contacts on her behalf. All she said was, "Let the story be told, but not my name. Let the voice stand for the ones who didn't make it back." So they made one small change to the Iron Echo exhibit. They added a speaker, and at the bottom of the display, under the timeline and photos, was a new plaque. Unidentified Field Command, Iron Echo, 2003. The voice that carried 14 men home, preserved with permission of source. Unknown voice of courage. They never added her face, but everyone who heard it, from that day forward, never forgot it, and neither will we. After the original combat audio was confirmed, things at the museum began to change. Not loudly, not publicly, but in subtle ways that only those paying close attention would notice. Sarah Mallory remained quiet. She continued to show up before sunrise, clock in without a word, and push her mop through the same long marble corridors she had walked for years. But the way people looked at her shifted. David Klein, the museum's director, felt a quiet obligation. He'd uncovered the truth, but Sarah had never once sought recognition. Still, he couldn't ignore what she had done. So he organized a private staff meeting in the break room. A modest gesture, just among those who worked with her. No announcements, no media. Just a few words of appreciation, a small printed citation, a framed photo of the original audio waveform, labeled EchoCom Alpha, April 2003. He left the items on the table and sent her a handwritten note inviting her to join them, but Sarah never came. Later that day, she stepped into his office, the invitation still folded neatly in her hand. She looked down at it for a moment before gently placing it on the corner of his desk. Her voice was calm and steady, just as it had always been. The same voice that once cut through gunfire and panic. I'm not a hero, Mr. Klein. I was just one link in the chain. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home. There was nothing to argue. David nodded, respecting the answer not just for what it said, but for what it didn't. He understood that to honor Sarah truly meant honoring her silence, her humility, and the quiet pride she carried. Not for herself, but for the ones she had left behind. A few days later, something unexpected happened. An elderly man visited the museum alone. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane. His jacket was worn at the shoulders but clean, his boots old but shined. He passed through the Cold War section, nodded through the Vietnam exhibit, and finally arrived at the Operation Iron Echo display. As he stood in front of the large screen, the updated audio clip began to play. Unit Bravo, move now, left flank exposed. He froze. Everything around him seemed to vanish. The children nearby, the hum of lights, even the whispers of tour guides in other rooms. Only that voice remained, steady and precise, calling orders over chaos. His hand clenched the cane. He turned slowly, scanning the room as if expecting her to be standing there. His eyes were glassy, his mouth half open, the words caught between disbelief and memory. He whispered almost to himself, "She's alive. That voice, she saved me." He stood there for a long time. Then he asked to speak to the director. David came down personally, unsure of what to expect. The old veteran grasped his hand firmly and looked him in the eye. "I was there," he said. "April '03, Outpost Delta. We were cut off. Radios were down. We had nothing." Then this voice came through. A woman. Gave us grid shifts, fire cover timing, even evac. We called her Widow Mark. Never saw her face. Never knew her name. David listened in silence, his throat tight. The man added, quieter now. "She got us home. Half our unit made it out because of her. I've wondered for years who she was, and today I heard her again." David didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth had found its way back, not with headlines, not with medals, but with a single voice echoing through a quiet hall. And now one more person remembered. The man with the cane, the veteran who had recognized her voice, went home with something burning in his chest. He hadn't spoken that name in over 2 decades. Widow Mark. He hadn't said it out loud, not since that night in April 2003 when the desert swallowed their comms. And the voice of a woman they'd never seen guided them out of the kill zone. That voice saved his life. It wasn't bravado or noise. It was calm, clipped, commanding. She gave them hope. She gave them orders when no one else could. And now, after all these years, she was pushing a mop across polished marble floors, invisible. Not anymore. That night he went digging through his drawer, past medical bills and grocery lists, until he found the old spiral-bound notebook. Dog-eared, dusty, but intact. Inside, names, numbers, nicknames, old codes. He picked up the phone. Some had long since moved away. Some didn't answer. Others he picked up immediately. "You remember Widow Mark?" he'd ask. A pause, then, "Of course I do. We all do." And he told them, quietly, where she was, what she was doing now. By the end of the week, there were 17 confirmations. They didn't want to make a scene. No press, no flags or fanfare. That wasn't how she lived, and it wouldn't be how they honored her. But they would show up, not for recognition, but for her. The following Monday, Sarah Mallory arrived at the museum before opening, like she always did. The winter sun had barely begun to push through the tall atrium windows. She walked past the exhibits, past the photographs of battles she remembered more by sound than by image. Then she turned the corner into the main hall and froze. 17 men stood in silence. They were older now, their faces lined, their hair thinner, their hands worn. But there was no mistaking who they were. Echo Forward Unit. She knew the posture, the eyes, the way they stood, even when they didn't realize they were standing together. They wore civilian clothes, jackets, flannels, boots, but every man bore the same insignia on his chest, a silver pin with the outline of their unit's emblem, faded but intact. Most had to dig it out of an attic box. Some hadn't worn it in years, but today they wore it for her. Sarah froze, her mop still in her hand. The air in the atrium felt thick, sacred. She looked from face to face, trying to reconcile the voices in her memory with the men before her now. One of them, a tall man with a deep scar on his cheek, nodded slowly, eyes misted. From the center of the group, the veteran with the cane stepped forward. He stood tall as he could manage. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and saluted her. Not the kind of salute given to a superior out of formality. This was the kind given to someone who had earned it, when no one else was watching. One by one, the others followed. No words, just silence. A wall of respect, forged not in rank, but in memory, in survival, and in truth, finally honored. Sarah's lips parted, but she couldn't speak. Her eyes filled, the weight of 2 decades pressing on her chest like a storm waiting to break. For so long she had stayed silent. She had swept the floors beneath their photographs. She had heard her own voice echo from a speaker and kept her head down. But now they stood for her. She lowered the mop, straightened her back. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, fighting the instinct to retreat. One hand rested over her heart. Her mouth didn't move, but her body did. She nodded. Just once. A single, solemn acknowledgement that said everything she couldn't find the words for. Then the man with the cane stepped closer. His voice was quiet, rough with time. No one gets to mop the floor around a name etched in history. Sarah let the silence answer. And in that moment, something changed. The museum, the building, the artifacts, the plaques, all faded into the background. The real history stood alive and breathing before her. It didn't need medals. It didn't need parades. It only needed to be remembered. She didn't speak of it again. But every morning after that, when she walked through the atrium, the security staff would stand a little straighter. The front desk team would greet her with more than a nod. The docents would pause their rehearsed stories just a beat longer when passing her by. She was still just the janitor, still quiet, still unseen by the tourists. But among those who knew, among those who mattered, she was never invisible again. In the weeks that followed, something quietly changed at the museum. There were no banners, no big announcements, but if you look closely, you'd notice a new sign in the East Wing, a modest bronze plaque mounted just beside the entrance to the communications exhibit. It read, "The Sarah Mallory Communications Wing," dedicated to the unseen voices who held the line when the world was falling apart. There was no photo, no biography, just a name, small, understated, and heavy with meaning. Visitors passed it daily. Some stopped to ask who Sarah Mallory was. Most didn't, but the ones who worked there, they knew. The curators knew. The veterans who came back year after year to walk those halls, they knew too. Sarah never stopped working. She didn't retire after the revelation. She didn't give interviews. She still arrived before the museum opened, pushed her cart past the same dusty corners, and mopped the same floor she had walked in silence for years. But now when she passed others in the hallway, they didn't look through her. They nodded. Some stood a little straighter. A few, quietly and without drawing attention, would pause their footsteps until she passed. She never asked for that respect, but it found her all the same. In the Iron Echo exhibit, the audio loop continued to play every half hour, but the narration had been revised. The voice commanding the units under fire, her voice, had been preserved. The final line, however, was left unchanged by Sarah's request. Beneath the speaker that played her directives, the small description simply read, "Unknown voice of courage, identity classified at request of source." That was her condition. No interviews, no honors, no medals. Her only wish was that the story be told not about her, but about the unity, the fear, the sacrifice, and the strength found in the midst of it all. "Don't make it about one person," she told Klein one day. "Let them remember what it took, not who said it." Every Friday evening, after her shift ended, Sarah would still take the long ride to the military cemetery. She never missed a visit. Same grave, same moment of silence. She knew that history often remembered names that shouted the loudest, the generals, the strategists, the decorated. But she had lived long enough to know that it was the quiet names, the whispered voices that kept the chaos from tipping over. As one veteran later wrote in the guest book beside her wing, some people shape history with titles and parades. Others do it with radio static and unwavering calm in the dark. She chose to be the floor beneath our boots. That's why we stood. And so, the museum carried on. Children still ran through the exhibits, asking questions about tanks and medals. Teachers still pointed to maps. Veterans still stood long and quiet by certain display cases. But something had shifted. Not in the museum itself, but in how people saw it. Because somewhere in those quiet halls between the plaques and the shadows, a once-forgotten voice now echoed, not to be remembered by fame, but to remind us what dignity really sounds like. Some people choose to be the foundation of history, not for glory, but so the rest of us can stand free. How many people like Sarah Mallory walk among us every day, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but quietly holding the world together? They don't ask for recognition. They don't post their stories online. They don't wear medals or demand respect. And yet, they've shaped history in ways most of us will never understand. We often walk past them. The elderly woman at the bus stop, the man sweeping the floor before dawn, the quiet worker who never raises their voice. We don't ask where they've been or what they've seen. Maybe we assume they've lived small lives, quiet lives. But what if those are the very people who once stood between chaos and survival? Who gave everything and then chose to disappear? Sarah never asked to be remembered, but someone remembered her anyway. And maybe that's the message. Not everyone wants the spotlight, but we all deserve to be seen. So we ask you gently, do you know someone like Sarah? Someone who served, sacrificed, or stood tall when no one else would, but never told their story? Maybe it was a grandparent, a neighbor, a quiet friend who used to wear a uniform and now wears silence like armor. If so, we invite you to share it in the comments below. Let their name, their memory, or even their quiet influence be heard, even just this once. Because when you tell their story, even in a few words, you're doing what Sarah never asked for, but what all of us in our hearts deeply need, to be remembered. And if this story moved you, if it made you pause and think about the unseen heroes all around us, please consider subscribing to this channel. We tell real stories, untold stories, the kind that don't make headlines, but change lives. Because sometimes the most powerful things in history weren't shouted. They were whispered, softly, in the background. And we believe those whispers deserve to be heard. History isn't always written in ink. Sometimes it's whispered through dust.